June has been Pride Month, and celebrations have taken place all over the world for the 52nd consecutive year. Gay pride marches began the year after the June 28, 1969 raid of the Stonewall Inn in New York. And despite a lingering hatred and stigma amongst some groups toward the LGBTQ community, there's no question when it comes to gay rights, we're in a better place than we were in 1970. But the 1980s actually were a step backward in many ways. The AIDS crisis deepened that stigma against LGBTQ folks and resulted in the deaths of more than 100,000 people. One federal agency was largely to blame.
The FDA kills people by implementing costly approval processes, which violate people's rights of self-medication and causes people to die waiting for drugs to get approved, and which prevents new drugs from being created.
The U.S. Food and Drug Administration was established in June 1906 when Theodore Roosevelt signed the Pure Food and Drug Act and assigned its enforcement to the Bureau of Chemistry, later renamed the FDA. It makes you wonder, what was the medical environment like around that time?
And you might see like old pharmaceutical labels that will say things like cough syrup. It has, cannabis and alcohol and chloroform in it or something. And that would just there was just wild drugs that were happening in the 19th century. Very loosely unregulated. There was no kind of licensing system. There was no FDA. The history of the FDA really kicks off in the 1930s. I mean, there was some light regulation for fraud and adulteration before then, but the elixir sulfonamide disaster happened where a bunch of children were killed by taking drug, elixir sulfonamide, which had been kind of diluted with antifreeze, and it was a horrible tragedy, public health tragedy, great public outcry for more governmental oversight for drugs.
In 1938, FDR signed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which once and for all gave the FDA oversight on the safety of food, drugs, medical devices, and cosmetics.
And then in the 1960s, around the time of the thalidomide disaster, the FDA, which had been empowered in 1938, expanded its power to not only regulate and approve drugs for safety, but also to require what is my main target, which is a very lengthy and expensive efficacy testing requirement, where it takes sometimes years for drugs to gain full approval and billions of dollars, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars for drug development. That really happened in the 1960s, and that's the system that we've been living under ever since. Now, in the 1970s, cancer researchers at the National Cancer Institute had a lot of criticism of FDA for their lengthy approval process in oncology. And so that was the first real pushback of this approval process.
That brings us to the AIDS crisis of the late 80s, but before we get there, 1981 deserves a mention. In addition to seeing the first HIV/AIDS case in the US, that's when the FDA approved a drug called Timolol. And, well, let's give the mic to our old friend, David Friedman.
Where the US FDA admitted to killing 100,000 people. They, for some reason, did not put the press release in that form. What they said was that they had decided to approve a beta blocker, a drug used to prevent a second heart attack. Beta blockers had been in use in Europe for, I think, something over a decade at this time, and there had been people arguing that the FDA should approve it. They finally approved it, and they estimated that its use would save 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year. Well, if its use saves 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year, and they kept it out of use for 10 to 12 years, that means that they killed about 100,000 people. But as I say, that's not the way they reported the story.
You can guess which month it was in 1981 that the first AIDS case in the US was discovered, and by that time the drug AZT, which ultimately would become the first one approved by the FDA for AIDS treatment, had been around, though not publicly available, for almost 2 decades. FDA approval for it to treat AIDS took 7 agonizing, deadly years.
In the 1980s, there was this kind of grassroots political advocacy group when the AIDS pandemic started called ACT UP. And ACT UP was a group of political advocates, and they would gather, for example, outside the FDA office, and they would chant things like, hey, FDA, how many people did you kill today? And I think it did make a big impact in sort of how the public saw what the FDA was doing. In general, one of the most effective health interventions for any large-scale pandemic is going to be pharmaceuticals. Like, that is the thing that's going to lead the way out of it. And we see this with the AIDS epidemic, where behavioral interventions, of course, like teaching people about safe sex, encouraging behavioral change, that can be an important component, but long-term sustainable pandemic management, epidemic management, pharmaceutical innovation is really like either something like vaccination or having effective treatment and therapeutic, or something like PrEP, which is preventative. Any of that, that's going to be a far more effective way of managing a public health crisis. And when we look at the way that the AIDS epidemic slowed down over the course of the 1990s, that's what we see, is that the most effective ways of slowing the pandemic have been pharmaceutical innovation. And so any regulatory structure that imposes a cost or makes it have a high price to engage in that innovation is a regulatory structure that exacerbates pandemics and epidemics.
It doesn't take much of an imagination to draw comparisons between the FDA's role in the AIDS crisis and its role in COVID, which we'll get to for sure. But before that, look, we realize we're throwing around some serious accusations that the FDA kills people. So at this point, it's worth pausing to analyze the how and why. And that starts with two terms.
The first is that by requiring a lengthy approval process where it takes a long time for drugs to get approved, people die waiting for drugs to get approved. That's called drug lag, which is the people who die due to the lag in approval times. And also, this very lengthy approval process discourages innovation for potentially life-saving drugs, and that's called drug loss. So if it's very costly or burdensome to develop a new drug, very risky that you could develop a new drug and it couldn't get approved, then fewer cool drugs get invented, and everybody, all of humanity suffers from the loss of that kind of knowledge. So the consequentialist kind of case against the approval process is drug lag and drug loss. But even if you don't get on board with that case, it kills people and causes death. Nevertheless, FDA regulations also violate people's rights to make just decisions about their own bodies, people's rights to use recreational drugs, to use any kind of new therapeutic, to take medical risks. I think these are fundamental rights. And so the FDA not only causes needless death, it does so by violating people's rights of self-medication.
If you agree with Professor Flanigan that self-medication is a fundamental right, hit those like and bell buttons and make sure to subscribe to our channel. Because as we see it, especially when it involves governmental structures, incentives get all twisted when power over other people becomes part of the equation.
People who are in regulatory positions, they have an incentive to avoid a drug disaster. So they have a strong incentive to avoid approving something that's dangerous, like letting people use something and then it turns out that people were using something that wasn't safe. And so if you think from the perspective of a person who is a regulator who's tasked with maintaining drug safety, they're extremely focused on avoiding adverse drug effects like the children that were killed from elixir sulfonamide or thalidomide babies, or think of Vioxx. So they have very strong incentives to maintain their institutional legitimacy by ensuring a very safe drug supply. And what they have very few incentives for is speeding up approval so that more people can have access to potentially effective drugs. So no one sees the people who die because of pharmaceutical approval delay. So it looks like say that there are AIDS patients that die because there was a delay in approving AZT. It looks to the public like they were dying of AIDS. It doesn't look like they're dying of regulation. On the other hand, if a drug is approved very quickly and it turns out to be unsafe and then people die from that drug, it looks to the public like they died from using an unsafe drug and they're going to hold regulators accountable for it. And so from the perspective of a regulator, they have very strong institutional incentives to be excessively cautious because no one holds them accountable for the deadly effects of their delay. That's drug lag. And there's even less accountability for drug loss because no one even considers all of the cool, interesting, beneficial drugs that could have been invented but weren't because it costs so much to bring drugs through the approval process.
Professor Friedman put it another way.
And suppose you permit a drug and it kills 20 people. Your career is finished. You're the person who made that mistake. Suppose you delay a drug and it kills 100 people. No cost to you at all.
And by the way, this, let's call it what it is, murder, doesn't even take into account other costly, counterproductive, and often downright farcical regulations the FDA sets. That'll be another video. Until then, with COVID so fresh in our minds, it's worth looking at the FDA's role in the pandemic so that hopefully next time it can improve. Yeah, we don't have high hopes either, but still.
So as we all know, the Moderna vaccine at least was developed very early in the pandemic. And the delay in getting those shots into arms was regulatory. Just getting an EUA, just getting the emergency use authorization for it, it took months and unnecessarily, seemingly, that they could have potentially approved it faster. Every day that they delayed approving it was a day that they pushed back the threshold of having enough vaccine protection in the population for people to avoid dying of COVID. And so every day of delay is a day of added death associated with a lack of vaccination in the population. What could they have done differently? Well, one thing that they could have done would just be to allow self-medication from the very get-go and to say, anybody can use this, but it's totally uncertified and approved, and we have no idea what it is. There was a group at MIT called RADVAC, where just these scientists developed their own COVID vaccines and I think shot it up their nose or something. And they knew that it was untested, and they took on the risk themselves of taking their kind of homebrewed COVID vaccine because they judged that it was worth it to do that. I think people are generally capable of judging the risks and benefits of taking an untested and unapproved drug, and if it's worth it to them, they should have the right to do it. That's a very radical proposal. Very few people are going to agree with me on that. Here's a second best. We could have allowed challenge trials. So it could have been that when the vaccine was developed very early on, that regulators permitted manufacturers to enlist healthy volunteers to deliberately become infected with COVID in a controlled environment and to test the effectiveness of the vaccine against that kind of challenge. I think that's also permissible. We let people take risky jobs in all sorts of contexts. Why not let people take the risky job of being in a challenge trial?
For those of us who are pro-liberty, that's the eternal question. Why not let people assess their own risk-reward ratios? When it comes to medicine, to jobs, even to things like seatbelts, people are far, far better at making those judgments for themselves than governments or government death administrations.